Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. You're about to walk a staircase that reshaped an entire investigation. Garlasco, Lombardy, a summer morning in 2007. A two-story villa on Via Giovanni Pascoli sits quiet behind a low wall and a neat hedge. Inside, at the turn to the cellar, a 26-year-old woman lies on the steps. There's no smashed door, no obvious ransack, no weapon in sight. A boyfriend tells authorities he found her. In towns like this, murder doesn't just take a life. It tears at the fabric of a quiet community. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. From the first officer's arrival, the scene is treated as a closed interior homicide. Access points are photographed and sealed. Entry frames show no pry marks. The floor plan is documented before anything moves. Foyer, hallway, stairwell angle, tread count, landing depth. Bloodstain mapping begins, pattern, directionality, and voids, strictly recorded for later trajectory work. Footwear impressions are photographed with scale, then cast. Each swab is labeled, bagged, and logged. Chain of custody starts here and cannot break. The home computer and phones are isolated for a lab acquisition with write blockers and a clock sync to lock timestamps. The first pass is about preserving questions, not answering them. Next comes the timetable. The date is Monday, August 13th, 2007. Investigators anchor the morning minute by minute. When shutters typically open, when neighbors heard steps, when vehicles passed. They pull call records, text histories, and device activity to establish a baseline of life. Who reached out, who didn't, and when silence begins to look like signal, a narrow window emerges that will become the spine of this case. I've seen it before. The story of a crime is often told by the minutes we can't account for. The victim is identified as Chiara Poggi, 26. She is not reduced to a headline. She's a person with a routine, a family home, and a morning that was supposed to be ordinary. Victimology here is functional, not sentimental. What she planned to do, who she might have let inside, whether she was expecting anyone. Those answers will matter more than adjectives. There's an early paradox investigators can't ignore. The path to the body is visibly contaminated by gravity and motion, yet some footwear presented later appears unusually clean for anyone who would have taken that path at the wrong time. It's not proof, it's a pressure point. Pair that with a missing weapon and a quiet entry, and three immediate hypotheses form: inside access, staged absence, or a very disciplined intruder. Each can be tested without guesswork, and each will be. If you're watching and thinking you've already solved it, slow down. True crime isn't a guessing game, it's a method. We'll move forward the way professionals do: scene, lab, timeline, witnesses, legal review. In places like Garlasco, the quickest answer is usually the worst one. By the time a homicide team understands a victim's routine, half the guesswork is gone. In Garlasco on Monday, August 13, 2007, the focus turns to what Chiara Poggi usually did on a summer morning, not what anyone imagines she might have done. Her day started in a quiet family villa on Via Giovanni Pascoli. Parents out of town, no scheduled visitors. A predictable pattern: wake, light household tasks, check messages, prepare for the day. That baseline is more than context. It's the control sample for everything that breaks pattern. Investigators map the house the way an auditor reads a ledger, room by room, decision by decision. Shutters, doors, and the path from foyer to the cellar stairs are noted against what neighbors expect to see on an ordinary weekday. Calls and texts from the previous 48 hours are charted. Friends confirm no late-night disputes, no urgent plans, no travel. Search history and recent files on her computer are preserved for later forensic imaging. The point isn't to narrate a life, it's to narrow the list of actions she would plausibly take before anyone else enters that structure. Access is the first real fork. With no signs of forced entry documented at the threshold, the case tilts toward someone she would allow near the door, or someone already familiar with the environment. That doesn't prove intimacy, only familiarity. The front approach is visible from the street. Side access is limited. An intruder theory would require risk-taking and precision without leaving obvious traces. A known person theory would require timing and opportunity. Either way, the clock becomes evidence. Timeline work starts from fixed sources, not memory. Cell networks give connection events. Handset logs show sent, received, or idle states. Any smart devices are time-synced and imaged under lab protocol so later analysis can reconstruct minute-level activity. Utility checks. Water, power spikes associated with appliances are requested where relevant. Neighbors are recontacted and asked for one thing only: anchors. When did you open your shutters? When did you start your car? When did the street first sound like daytime? In small towns, these anchors exist. They just need to be collected without leading questions. From this build, a narrow morning window takes shape. It doesn't name a suspect. It defines opportunity. Inside that window, the victim is most likely alive at point A and not alive by point B. Everything else has to fit: movement in and out, phone silence, any claimed work or travel, and how long a person would need to approach, attack, and depart without drawing attention. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean timelines can hide messy acts. Victimology remains functional. Kiara was 26, educated, organized, and anchored to that house while her family was away. She had social ties consistent with her age and a relationship that placed someone close to her day-to-day schedule. There were no restraining orders on file, no police calls in the immediate lead-up, no flagged threats. The takeaway for an audience used to American cases is simple. In a domestic setting without forced entry, routine and access matter more than speculation about motive. You don't need motive to draw a map. You need movement. Investigators test the morning claims from people who interacted with her or had reason to be near the house. Statements are compared against objective artifacts, call detail records, device activity, and any corroborating anchors collected from the neighborhood. If someone says they were working, they'll be asked to substantiate that claim with computer logs, commute time, or third-party confirmations. If someone says they arrived to help, they'll be asked to account for approach, footwear, and whether their route matches the physical realities of the scene. No accusations, just reconciliation between words and timestamps. There's also a practical human point worth stating plainly. When violence erupts in a place where people don't expect it, communities tend to fill silence with theories. That's not evidence. Evidence is what holds up when a defense expert tries to break your chain of custody or your minute-by-minute reconstruction. Here, the chain starts with a home in Lombardy and a routine that should have carried a young woman through an ordinary morning. It didn't. The case will explain why. If you were building this timeline yourself, which single artifact would you trust most to verify presence? A neighbor's recollection, a device log, or a system timestamp from a service provider? Different answers say a lot about how you weigh memory against machines. The investigation moves from mapping routine to reconciling claims with hard clocks. Monday, August 13, 2007, isn't handled as a mood. It's treated as a schedule. When the lab returns the first pulls from call detail records and handset activity, a narrow interval appears between the last verified sign of Kiara Poggi being alive and the moment responders secure her stairwell. It isn't hours. It's tight. Approximately 23 minutes. That window becomes the frame every statement must fit. Footwear work is straightforward. Impressions photographed near the stair path are scaled, enhanced, and compared to reference sizes. Investigators don't claim a brand match. They don't need to. They ask a simpler question. If you pass through an area during or immediately after a violent event, what transfer should your shoes show? And if there's little or none, how do you explain it against the geometry of that stair? It's not proof by itself. It's an anomaly that demands either a credible reason or a contradiction somewhere else in the record. Digital forensics is the second lever. Handsets and any computers tied to the house are imaged under lab protocol. Analysts line up events, outgoing calls, received texts, idle periods against network time. They look for gaps that do not reflect normal behavior and for spurts of use that seem too convenient. A device that rests quietly through most mornings and suddenly goes active during the critical minutes is not automatically suspicious, but it will be tested against the user's stated movements. In quiet communities, neighbors remember shutters, cars, and footsteps. Devices remember seconds. With the window defined, interviews are rerun with less patience for broad strokes. If someone says, "I was working," the team wants more than a statement. They want artifacts, keystroke logs, workstation access, file saves, commute durations. If someone says, "I arrived and found her," investigators note approach routes, footwear, and the sequence of actions taken once inside. They're not looking for drama. They're looking for a timeline that doesn't wobble under weight. One claim about being elsewhere collides with the clock. It's not that the claim is impossible, it's that it leaves too many minutes unaccounted for in a case that can't spare even 5. The walk time from a plausible origin, the time required to enter without forcing a door, the time to inflict injuries and exit without drawing attention, all of it must fit inside the same narrow band. When numbers get tight, stories usually do too. There's also a bicycle in the file, a domestic detail that at first barely registers. Later media will focus on whether biological traces on family bike components mattered and how much. Here, the cautious approach is the right one. A bike is a potential vector for movement. If it moves, where does it go and does anyone see it? If it doesn't, why is it in play? Analysts don't jump to conclusions. They test chain oil marks, pedal wear, and practical travel time against the window already on the board. In towns like this, murders don't happen in abstraction. They happen between houses, on streets people recognize. A victim doesn't need biography to be respected in an investigation. She needs precision. For Chiara, precision is the most respectful thing you can offer. Her morning is charted not to reduce her life, but to preserve it from noise. The last confirmed action, the first unambiguous silence, the moment help is called. Those anchors keep a real person from becoming a theory. The footwear paradox won't go away. If someone approaches the cellar steps at the wrong time, the physics of the path say you should expect visible transfer. When the record shows clean soles instead, the investigation asks whether that person came earlier, later, or not at all. That's not emotion, that's sequencing. And sequencing is what this case will live or die on. As the day's work closes, the time window, the footwear questions, and the first device correlations line up in a way that is either a coincidence or the outline of opportunity. The data feels tidy. Sometimes tidy is the problem. Real life is messy. If the record is too clean, it often means something was cleaned. A quick note for anyone watching who's lived in a small town. Your memory of ordinary is evidence. When did the street come alive? When did you hear the first scooter? When did a familiar figure pass by? Those details can lock a minute as surely as a server timestamp. The routine is set, the window is narrow, and now every claim of where I was meets a clock. Monday, August 13th, 2007 in Garlasco isn't a mood, it's a sequence. Investigators build a single sheet that lines up the morning minute by minute. On it sit 3 things: what people say, what the devices say, and how long real-world movement actually takes. Anything that can't live on that sheet doesn't survive the case. Statements come first. They're collected cleanly and transcribed without coaching. If someone says they were working, the team asks for proof a judge can hold: workstation access times, file save stamps, door badge logs, or a supervisor who can fix minutes, not just around then. If someone says they traveled, the team wants departure time, route, distance, and a plausible speed on local roads at that hour. I was busy means nothing to a timeline. Either you can put yourself on a clock, or you can't. Next comes the walk test. It's easy to say a person could have reached the villa and left unseen. It's harder when you actually measure the time. Investigators drive and walk the routes people name. They mark how long it takes to park without blocking sight lines, how long to reach the door, how long to move through a quiet house without making noise a neighbor would notice, and how long to depart without drawing attention. Those numbers are not guesses, they're stopwatch results. If your story needs more minutes than the window gives, your story is wrong. Device activity is the equalizer. Phones and computers are acquired and examined under standard protocol, then plotted against carrier network time. Analysts aren't chasing drama. They're asking one question: did this device behave like it usually does, or did it act helpful to someone's version of events? A silent device in the crucial band might be normal. It might also be silence with a purpose. A sudden burst of activity exactly when a person needs to be somewhere else is a red flag. Not proof, but a reason to look harder. One account collides with the sheet. It places its speaker at work, then commuting, then returning. On first listen, it sounds orderly. On paper, it cuts too close to the 23 minutes between the last confirmed sign of Chiara Poggi alive and the time responders lock the stairwell. Commuting plus entry plus exit plus the sequence of calls afterwards simply don't fit unless you erase practical steps like parking, approaching, and leaving without notice. The sheet doesn't bend to make space for a story. The story has to contract to fit the sheet. Investigators also look for what people forget to include. Delays at intersections, the time to start a computer and actually log in, the lag between telling yourself you did a thing and the system recording that you did it. Those small frictions add up. The difference between I left around 9 and I badged out at 9:07:38 is the difference between opinion and evidence. In a case where the lethal interval isn't even half an hour, every friction matters. Footwear questions reappear only because the clock forces them to. If you claim to have taken the path to the cellar in those minutes, the physics of the steps suggest transfer. If your shoes don't reflect that, either your timing is off, your route is off, or your claim doesn't match reality. Investigators don't argue about brands or tread patterns until they need to. They ask whether your soles tell the same story your mouth does. When they don't, the sheet records the conflict and moves on. There's a human side to this that deserves one clear sentence. People misremember under stress. They also try to make themselves useful to police. Both instincts can wreck a timeline. That's why the team in Garlasco keeps the questions short and the anchors hard. When did you badge? When did you save that file? When did your engine cut off on Via Piscoli? Each answer converts a memory into a minute. Minutes are the only language this case accepts. As interviews cycle, the pattern is familiar to any detective who's worked a domestic setting homicide. Most accounts settle into the sheet with small corrections. A few keep slipping. The ones that slip tend to share traits: vague departure times, rounded arrivals, and a habit of placing themselves just outside the critical band without providing the artifact that proves it. That is where investigators concentrate, not because those people are chosen, but because the math chose them. By late review, the sheet has done what it was built to do: compress opportunity into a scale you can test. It doesn't name a killer, it names possibilities that obey physics, distance, and time. When the team looks at the board, they see where a person could have been and where they couldn't have been. They see which accounts require fewer assumptions and which require you to believe in lucky seconds. And they see that a clean story often demands too much cleanliness from the world around it. There's value for all of us in that lesson. In any community, accountability isn't an attitude, it's a timestamp. When a life ends in a house like this, the honest thing we can do for the victim is resist shortcuts and keep the sheet honest. In towns like Garlasco, truth gets measured the same way as anywhere else, 1 minute at a time. By the time the timeline and shoe logic hardened, the file had already taken a sharp turn most people outside Italy don't expect. The first trial court and then an appellate panel acquitted. That could have been the end. Instead, prosecutors petitioned Italy's Supreme Court of Cassation, the body that doesn't retry facts but audits legal reasoning. Think of it as a quality control gate. If the lower court's logic is incomplete or internally inconsistent, cassation can annul and send the case back to be re-argued with tighter standards. Cassation reviewed the record, the opinions, and the way the earlier judges handled 3 pillars: the narrow morning window, the footwear transfer question, and the treatment of digital device activity alongside the bicycle angle reported in the file. The court didn't declare someone guilty. It asked whether the acquittals adequately explained why those anomalies didn't matter. On October 31, 2013, the answer was no. The acquittals were annulled, and the case was remanded for a new appellate review that had to confront the evidentiary conflicts head-on and articulate reasoning that could withstand scrutiny. Remand changed the temperature. On paper, the instructions were technical: address the time interval with precision, weigh the transfer expectations against the scene geometry, and reconcile device events with claimed movements. In practice, it meant every comfortable assumption was stripped out. The new panel was required to say plainly whether an account that needed almost all of the 23 minutes could still be plausible once you included real-world frictions like parking, approach, entry, and exit. It also had to say why shoes that should have recorded travel through a contaminated path did not, and whether that non-record could be squared with innocence without relying on generalities. Defense and prosecution adjusted accordingly. The defense stressed uncertainty, missing weapon, absence of a recorded motive, the limits of pattern and footwear analysis, and cautions about overreading digital artifacts. The prosecution leaned into physics and sequencing, distance and time, the practical steps required to commit a rapid assault and depart unseen, the behavior of devices around the critical minutes, and how clean stories often require improbably clean surroundings. The new appellate court wasn't asked to find the perfect truth. It was asked to choose the most coherent explanation the record could support. On December 17, 2014, the Milan Appeals Court issued a conviction, later calibrated to 16 years under abbreviated procedure rules. The opinion didn't claim a cinematic motive. It linked a compact window of opportunity to movement realities and to the expectation that a person who traversed the stairwell during the crucial period would have left more telltale traces. The court treated the bicycle and DNA mentions as contextual, not decisive, and anchored its logic in the clock and the pathway. In plain terms, time plus path plus behavior outweighed competing narratives. Because Italian practice provides one more check, the case returned to cassation. The question this time wasn't, did the lower court miss key conflicts? It was, did the lower court now explain itself well enough within the law? On December 12, 2015, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction. That ruling made the judgment final. No new trial, no second ending, no later chapter that rewrites the past. What came after, sentence administration, and, years later, 2025 technical re-examinations, belongs to the post-judgment world. As of October 8, 2025, that legal outcome still stands. If you're watching from the U.S., two clarifications matter. First, cassation isn't a jury of last resort. It's a law court that polices methods. Second, reasonable doubt isn't a free-floating feeling. It has to live inside a structure of reasons that engage the evidence on the table. When cassation annulled the acquittals in 2013, it wasn't declaring guilt. It was saying the explanations given for doubt didn't do the work the law requires. There's a human dimension that deserves one sentence. A family in a town wanted certainty. Courts can't deliver that. They deliver decisions that meet legal standards. In Garlasco, the final structure is this: a tight window, physical expectations about transfer, digital and practical sequences that support a path, and a judgment that chose coherence over comfort. This isn't where our story ends, it's where the legal line is drawn. We'll still walk through what sentence administration looked like afterward and how 2025 re-exams were authorized, not as an alternate timeline, but as a technical audit that any modern system should welcome. The point is not to create drama out of process. It's to show how process resists drama and keeps the narrative honest. Before we move on, fix the spine in your mind so later details don't shake it loose. Interior stairwell scene on August 13, 2007. No forced entry recorded, no weapon recovered, 3 evidentiary pillars under sustained review, acquittals annulled in 2013, conviction in 2014, conviction upheld in 2015. Everything after is administration or re-examination under a final judgment. When the case came back on remand, the job wasn't to reinvent the facts, it was to explain them. In order, under law, without gaps. The Milan Appeals Court took the record as it stood. A tight morning interval on August 13, 2007. An interior stairwell scene inside the Poggi home. No forced entry, no recovered weapon, and a set of behaviors and device events clustered around the same narrow band of time. The judges weren't asked to deliver drama. They were asked to choose the most coherent explanation and write it down so a higher court could test the reasoning. They started with the clock. The panel fixed a limited window between the last reliable sign of Chiara Poggi being alive and the arrival of first responders. The question became practical. Within those minutes, who had realistic opportunity when you account for approach, entry, action, and exit? Alibi statements were tested against artifacts, badge logs, file saves, and device activity. Accounts that used nearly all the available minutes while ignoring real-world friction, parking, moving through a quiet house, leaving without attention, were not rejected for style. They were rejected because the math didn't hold. From time, the court moved to pathway. The stairwell geometry and the expectation of transfer were weighed against claims about presence during the critical period. The opinion did not rest on a brand or a tread model. It asked a simpler question. Would a person who traversed that path at that time likely carry telltale traces? And if so, why were they not there? The absence of expected transfer was treated as a conflict that required a credible explanation, not as a standalone proof. In short, time narrowed opportunity. The path tested whether an account could live inside that opportunity. Digital evidence was treated as context with teeth. Phones and computers don't tell you intent, but they do tell you whether a claimed routine agrees with network time. The panel evaluated device behavior in and around the window. What woke, what stayed idle, what moved, and asked whether those events supported a person being elsewhere or pointed back toward the house. A tidy sequence that aligned too neatly with a self-serving narrative was not taken at face value. It was compared to independent anchors. The court also addressed what was not in the file. No one produced the weapon. The opinion made clear that a missing object does not dissolve a coherent chain when time, path, and behavior already point in one direction. As for motive, the panel did not pretend to script a reason. Italian courts can convict without narrating psychology if the physical and temporal structure is strong enough. The bicycle DNA references noted in media were recognized as part of the larger context, but not treated as decisive. The backbone remained the clock and the root. On December 17, 2014, the Milan court convicted and imposed a sentence later set at 16 years under abbreviated procedure rules. The opinion's core was not a new fact, but a transparent method. Fix the window, test the alibis against artifacts, test the route against transfer expectations, and ask whether device behavior supports or breaks the story. The chain survived that scrutiny. Because the structure matters as much as the result, the case returned to the Supreme Court of Cassation. This time, the review question was narrow. Did the appellate court now explain itself in a legally coherent way? On December 12, 2015, Cassation upheld the conviction. That ruling closed the trial pathway. No alternate ending exists in the record. What follows years later, administration of the sentence and 2025 technical reexaminations, is post-judgment procedure. As of October 8, 2025, the 2015 judgment remains in force. There's a reason to show how the courts wrote this, line by line. Families and communities deserve clarity. The law can't offer certainty, but it can demand explanations that don't wobble. In this file, the judges chose the explanation that fit the minutes, the movement, and the machines, and they wrote it so anyone could check the work. After the 2015 ruling, the story moved from courtroom logic to day-to-day custody. That part is quieter, but it still has rules worth understanding. In Italy, a final conviction doesn't end the paperwork. It starts a long phase of sentence administration, placement, work programs, periodic reviews, and a running record of conduct. For Chiara Poggi's case, that meant a person convicted in connection with her death served time under a system that can tighten or loosen restrictions without changing the judgment itself. From 2016 through 2024, the focus was compliance, prison routine, program eligibility, psychological assessments, employment prospects inside or outside custody, and behavior reports that either build trust or trigger recalibration. Italy's penitentiary code allows progressive treatment, small steps that test whether a person can function under partial supervision. None of that reweighs the trial evidence. It measures present-tense conduct against public safety standards and rehabilitation targets. By 2025, a notable shift appeared: semi-liberty. In plain language, that regime lets a prisoner work or study outside during the day and return to custody overnight. It is not parole. It does not erase a conviction. It's a controlled privilege monitored by the surveillance court, which can suspend or revoke it if new risks emerge. In this file, semi-liberty was granted in 2025, and almost immediately, prosecutors in Pavia moved forward with technical re-examinations that had nothing to do with leniency. Fresh lab work on previously collected material and 3D documentation of the scene to test movement hypotheses. Those re-exams did not nullify the 2015 judgment. They coexisted with it. Supervision adapted to the new posture. When investigators launch technical steps that might touch the integrity of earlier reasoning, the surveillance court can reconsider the custody framework to avoid perception problems or real risks of interference. That is why, in late spring 2025, there was litigation over whether semi-liberty should continue while the scientific audits were underway. The legal point is simple. Privileges can change day to day. The conviction does not unless a competent court later grants reopening or relief. As of October 8, 2025, there has been no ruling that cancels the 2015 result. For viewers used to U.S.'s terminology, the closest analogy is a blend of work release and community custody under judicial oversight. The person leaves for approved hours, follows strict routes and schedules, and reports back. Missed check-ins or contact with prohibited parties can end the regime instantly. A single judge doesn't decide this in a vacuum. Probation staff, prison administrators, and prosecutors feed the court with reports and risk assessments. It's administrative law, not a retrial. There's also a human consideration that belongs here and nowhere else. Families live with outcomes, not debates. Administrative changes, like work permission or an order to sleep in a facility rather than a cell, can feel like new verdicts to a community still grieving. They aren't. They're adjustments the law allows while the sentence runs. The correct response isn't outrage or celebration, it's verification. Are the rules being followed? Are conditions enforced? Is the system keeping both the public and the process intact? In Garlasco, those questions mattered in 2025 because public attention returned when the science teams went back to the file. The through line must stay intact. A homicide in Garlasco, Lombardy on August 13, 2007. A final conviction upheld in 2015, and years later, scientific re-exams that test parts of the record without creating a second ending. Sentence administration sits between those poles, making sure the punishment runs, the rules hold, and the public is protected. In the years after the appellate courts closed their work, this case shifted from courtroom argument to technical housekeeping. In 2025, prosecutors in Pavia authorized 2 narrow audits, fresh DNA screening on archived items, and a full 3D documentation of the Poggi Villa to test movement against measured distance and time. The directive was simple: check the file with modern tools, control for contamination, and see whether anything material was missed. No theatrics, no new narrative, just verification. The DNA pass targeted traces earlier methods left unresolved. Analysts logged every custody handoff, swab origin, and lab environment before touching a sample. Any profile had to survive 2 tests. First, a clean chain. Second, compatibility with the minute-locked morning window of August 13, 2007. An isolated signal with a messy paper trail, or one that doesn't fit the clock, doesn't move the law. Laser scans and drone imagery did something different. They turned the house into a measurable model: approach vectors, stair angles, occlusions, line of sight at the door. When fused to the established device timeline, the model either gave a route seconds to exist or took them away. It reduced argument to arithmetic. At the same time, custody didn't freeze. Semi-liberty, daytime work, night return, was granted under surveillance court supervision and then reassessed once the audits began. That's administration, not reversal. Italian law allows privileges to tighten or loosen while a sentence runs. The standard never changed. The 2015 judgment stood unless a competent court later said otherwise. As of October 8, 2025, nothing in the audits has replaced the legal spine you followed. Garlasco, Lombardy, Italy, interior stairwell, no forced entry, no recovered weapon, a narrow window linked to pathway expectations and device behavior, acquittals annulled in 2013, conviction issued December 17, 2014, conviction upheld December 12, 2015, 16 years. That is the single ending on the record. A true crime story should leave more than noise. For Chiara Poggi, 26, respect means precision. Preserve scenes, time every step, prefer artifacts over guesses. For communities, it means accepting that a technical audit done years later is a safety valve, not a sequel. If the science ever finds something new that is clean, material, and compatible with the timeline, courts have mechanisms to hear it. Until then, the verdict is the verdict. Thank you for staying with the evidence and the law. One case, one scene, one outcome, while the system continues to test itself the way it should, carefully and in public. I'm leaving you with this. Justice is built on minutes, not myths. Preserving scenes, checking devices, and telling the truth the first time. Those habits protect every family in this country. I've learned that certainty is rare, but discipline is a choice. What detail mattered most to you? The clock, the path, or the devices? Did anything change your view of reasonable doubt? If this story moved you, drop a comment with where you're watching from, or tell me why it didn't and what I should do better. And if you want more fact-driven cases told straight, please subscribe to the channel.